It is my pleasure to welcome David Malone back to this podium. For quite some time, David has been involved with issues that involve development, most recently as head of Canada's International Development Research Centre. He is currently the rector of the United Nations University and holds the rank of Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. In this position, David continues to pursue his meticulous skills as a researcher and educator as he seeks solutions to challenging global problems that are of concern to the United Nations, its peoples, and member states. Development continues to be at the top of the list. In a recently edited work by David entitled International Development, Ideas, Experience, Prospects, you'll find an extremely useful volume of work that examines the ideas behind development, their origins, how they have changed and spread over time, and how they may evolve over the coming decades.
A couple of personal experiences to anchor my own interest in development. When I was 8, my parents went to live in a country I grew to love deeply, a great nation historically in the world, Iran. And it's hard to believe today, but in 1962, Iran was the poster child for development. According to the experts, it was doing everything right, mainly because it was doing what the experts had told them to do. And what the formula was for Iran was essentially a forced march towards Western-style modernization. And all of the indicators, by the way, for those who think everything can be quantified successfully, all of the indicators were positive. The indicators suggested huge success. There was a very lonely group of sociologists and anthropologists of Iranian and French origin who kept publishing articles saying, this storyline isn't really true. Society in the country, particularly rural society and poorer urban communities, are under great strain. They don't like the project, and the project is moving too fast for them. Now, 6 months after my parents got to Iran in June of 1963, there were some very violent riots in Tehran and one or two other Iranian cities, fomented by clerics in the nearby holy city of Qum, but clearly finding quite a large following. You might have thought this would draw the attention of the so-called experts, but it didn't. It was comprehensively ignored as an aberration, and from that point on, things started to go downhill for the triumphalist narrative that all of this was working so well. We all know how the story ended in historical terms. At the blink of an eye, we had the Iranian Revolution in 1978. The country hadn't been so happy after all. So I mention this because some of my classmates were involved in some of this. Some of them died. Many of them were in jail. Many others' lives have been affected by this. As well, as I was growing up, although as a child, of course, I had no political consciousness because I loved Iran, I was constantly thinking about it. So this whole sad tale internalized itself in me and made me extremely skeptical of consensus and so-called experts in the field of development. They're nearly always self-interested, like other experts. That is the one thing experts tend to have in common. Many of them do fabulous research work and so on, but I'm fairly skeptical. The second example, not too far from Iran, was when I was a very young professional in the Middle East, working for the Canadian government. Somebody in the government called me up one day and said, we have an awful lot of aid projects in Sudan, and we actually have nobody keeping an eye on them. Would you perhaps do this? And I was all of 23, and it was actually a huge development program. But I said, sure, why not? And it was an opportunity to discover Sudan, an extraordinary country with marvelous people, remarkably elegant people. And it was rather thrilling for me. What did the Canadian aid program consist of? It consisted of a number of very large projects in quite diverse fields. Dryland farming, for example, because we were told at the time, and it's still potentially true, that Sudan would be the breadbasket of Africa. Some of you will remember that description of Sudan. We also, like many others, were supporting the building of roads, forestry inventory. We have lots of forests in Canada, my country, and so we know that forestry inventories can be useful. Things of that nature, all of which were well-intended and might have been useful. 25 years later, I visited Sudan and had some downtime and was able to go in search of these projects that I had been tangentially involved in. Interestingly, there wasn't a trace of any of them, only 25 years later. And this, as Hercule Poirot would have said, gives one powerfully to reflect. So I asked some of my Sudanese friends, the Sudanese are very faithful in friendship, so they were still speaking with me, why perhaps this outcome? And they said, well, you know, we're basically a pastoralist country. What matters here is cattle. Cattle don't really need roads. In fact, roads rather interfere. Cattle may like forest shade, but they don't actually need it. And dryland farming is actually the enemy of grazing. And so, you know, perhaps with your good intentions, you projected your fantasies onto Sudan and came up with these very well-intended projects, none of which really responded to who we are and what we like to do, and with all our faults, how we saw our own country moving. And I think there was profound truth in those remarks. So I wish I'd known all of that when I was 23, but I didn't. So again, these experiences inspire a degree of caution, skepticism of a positive sort, a sort of questioning skepticism about the breezes of enthusiasm that waft through the world of development. If there's a trend in thinking on development in recent decades, it's to move away from grant schemes, actually. Some of you may remember the very exciting at the time dependencia model in Latin America, which actually had one very good outcome. It caused Latin Americans to believe in themselves much more than they had done, but in practice didn't work terribly well. There were a number of other grant schemes which read better than they implemented, so to speak, inelegantly. And so what we see the world of development moving away from is those grant schemes, a greater interest in specificity on the ground. And if there's one thing that emerges from the book, it's that we tend to think, when we think of other countries, of them as polities, political organizations, or economies. We read quite a lot about the economies of other countries. We read about their political situation. It's more unusual for us to read about how they function as societies and what their social preferences are and how these might differ from those of neighboring countries and how there might be different social preferences within a given country. And one of our conclusions in the book is that actually for development, social preferences of populations have mattered much more than economic planning, helpful as that sometimes is, and political leadership, although that played a very important role in Asia, particularly. And the reason I mention this is the last gasp of efforts to come to a unified scheme for development were encapsulated in something that came to be known as the Washington Consensus. In the very late 1980s, it was an idea that involved policies that were basically applicable to all countries, sound financial practices, doubtless a good idea, many other things, but basically a one-size-fits-all model. Need I add that it failed miserably? Not only did it fail miserably, but it became so controversial as to kill itself in very short order. And rather wisely, nobody since then has tried one of these grand schemes. By the way, if you need any convincing on how different very successful development tracks can be from each other, think of India and China over the last 30 years. These are the two countries that have produced, large countries that have produced consistently the two highest rates of growth over the last 30 years. They had completely different development models. China's first, after Deng Xiaoping came to power, focused on feeding the population, so much of which had starved during earlier waves of economic policy in China, then moving to export-oriented industries for which they needed strong infrastructure, which they somehow or other managed, such that within 30 years, probably the greatest growth in history, and also the largest adventure in pulling people out of absolute poverty unfolded in China over the last 30 years. It's worth reflecting on, as we're often quite critical of China, what they have achieved in the last 30 years. India never achieves anything in as linear a fashion as China is able to, but they had a green revolution, an agricultural revolution during the 60s and 70s, rather reluctantly, but because essentially the Prime Minister of India felt it was undignified to accept food aid from the US at a time when you disagreed with the US over Vietnam. And India then liberalized its economy in the early 1990s, not a great deal, but just to unleash the Indian genius for entrepreneurship, and as it turns out, but nobody knew at the time, the Indian genius for services. So a lot of back office jobs and so on helped propel India forward. Not much of a trace of industrialization in India, and even less of successful agriculture, which was so vital in China. So two completely different models of development that each produced quite a lot of growth, which inevitably, by design or not, pulled quite a large number of people out of poverty by the hundreds of millions in China over the last 20 years or so. So countries differ, and within countries, as I say, a lot of different preferences contend. Where are we today? First of all, it's important to remember that since 2008, and that's quite a long time, that's 7 years now, the industrialized world has been either in crisis or post-crisis recovery. In many ways started in 2007. Meanwhile, the confident predictions of many people that the developing world would immediately crash and burn were disproved. Asia continued to chug along with very impressive rates of growth, and in a way more surprisingly for all of us, so did Africa. Because Africa quietly, without anybody much noticing, had, as of about the year 2000, on average started growing at rates of growth somewhere between 4 and 6%. And compounded, that's very serious growth. And Latin America, which has done less well on growth, has done brilliantly on social progress and experimenting on social development. So in many ways, we are the problem children of the global economy, and the developing world is not. And that is a very difficult shift for us in the West to adjust to, because we always thought we were teaching them what to do, because we were ipso facto developed, and we are. But we always thought, I think, that we would perform better somehow than these laggard societies But today, in terms of economic growth and in terms of dynamism also sometimes, particularly in Asia, they may be ahead of us. Secondly, we had been focused for a very long time simply on growth in the developing world, because it's true, by the way, without growth, I don't know of any country that has developed. So for those who are against growth, you might as well own up to the fact that there may not be a great deal of development without it. But on the other hand, the single-minded focus on growth was missing other things that were very important in development, particularly in fields of social policy endeavor, education, health, and so on. And that was Amartya Sen's great insight, and his friend Mahbub el-Haq, who eventually produced the idea of human development rather than economic development, which has gained considerable traction then, and which led to the UN's most impressive economic report every year, the Human Development Report. Human development came to be accepted to be very important, and today, which you wouldn't have believed 40 years ago, the World Bank and the IMF are both fairly focused on social policy as well as strictly economic growth and balance of payments. So those lessons are now widely, I'd say, shared. There's also been an effort to focus on a number of groups within society. Obviously, education is of interest to young people, but the role of women in society, in economies, I think has become much more of a priority nearly everywhere, including in reluctant societies like Japan, where I live today. The conclusion is that Japan will never break out of stagnation, whatever the social preferences of the men of Japan might be, unless there's more openness to the women of Japan playing a strong role in the economy. Civil society, the world outside of the private sector and government, has come to play a much bigger role in development around the world. Campaigning for various things throughout the developing world, including China. When people are unhappy in China today, they make it known with local authorities or others. We're so used to it that we take it for granted, but 50 years ago, it was not a dominant feature of the developing world. How might one think of the next 50 years in development writ large? What are some propositions that might be worth debating? Well, first, ongoing trends in international migration, in financial flows, in climate change will determine outcomes for all of us, actually, not just developing countries. So here we're in a global boat together with lots of others on these very broad international trends, and it's no longer really us against them, which is a change, or us on a pedestal and them striving beneath us. Secondly, I think a lot of instability in developing countries, researchers and others have concluded over the last 20, 30 years, comes from inequalities within societies. Not the fact that there are rich people and poor people. All societies exhibit those forms of inequalities in more or less stark ways, but rather groups within society that are disadvantaged, and if they're disadvantaged enough, be they ethnic groups, religious minorities, others, may choose to rise up in one way or another. So I think there's a greater awareness that various forms of inequality can destabilize societies, and that needs a bit more attention. Development assistance, aid, will play much less of a role in the next 50 years. Many of us have as an intuition that it never played that much of a role, but quite a lot of money was spent on it. Most of it at home, by the way. When you investigate how aid is actually spent by various aid agencies, a great deal of it is spent in the home country before any of it is ever seen. If we're lucky, there will be, by the end of this year, broad agreement, perhaps not a full consensus, on new approaches to climate change. And the agreement between China and the United States last year was critical in opening up that perspective, because until then the UN had been locked in a very unpromising and contentious debate over who needed to do what. And China and the US set an example and challenged others to follow their example. And coming from China and the US, that's a pretty powerful call. So other countries are now trying to figure out what they are prepared to do individually. Increasingly, thinking on development and action on development is going to come from the developing countries themselves. I think the role of the World Bank in all of this, and the World Bank has been a very strong institution, the UN development actors, all of that is going to become much more important because the developing countries, which have already demonstrated they can develop rather impressively, are going to be the ones in the driver's seat, and that gives me, personally, a great deal of satisfaction. Now, the UN and development, you'll all know or have a sense that the UN has been deeply engaged with development since the era of decolonization, particularly. And indeed, this caused the UN system to grow enormously. All sorts of agencies were created in one way or another to promote development, or at least they reoriented themselves from their primary mission towards promoting development. In the run-up to this year, a few new insights have arisen. One, that any new set of development goals should apply to all countries rather than just developing countries. It's not like all of us have fixed everything at home. Thinking of my country, Canada, which has done reasonably well overall, we have huge gaps and deficits. For example, the situation of our Aboriginal people and the gap in human development of many of those communities and the rest of the population, something we should be addressing at home rather than preaching to other countries. So that, I think, is a happy insight. How much the industrialized countries will actually do on the Sustainable Development Goals remains to be seen. The second insight is more profound, which is that when the Millennium Development Goals were adopted shortly after the turn of the millennium, they were fairly succinct, and they were mostly about quantities of things. For example, universal primary education available to all kids around the world. And that was the goal because many kids didn't have access to primary education around the world. This time round, the goal is much more qualitative. Experts, societies themselves are quite worried about the quality of what kids get in school, and quite rightly so. Just having bums on seats in schools doesn't achieve a great deal in terms of rapidly changing economies and societies. You need to be learning useful skills and knowledge that is valuable to kids. And that insight on quality more than quantity is increasingly reflected across a wide range of fields of human endeavor in the developing world. And it shows how much progress there has actually been in development, that you've moved from worrying about the number of kids in primary school to thinking about things like quality education and perhaps even, although it's very aspirational for many, lifelong education, which is a great idea. So these are fundamental shifts in thinking about what is achievable in the developing world and what the developing world wants to achieve for itself. Where are we headed? First of all, for the UN, there needs to be, again, some modesty. The idea that we can project 15 years to know what the circumstances of the world will be in 2030, I think we need to be fairly modest about that. Why? Because the news in 2015 is so much better for development than anybody expected. The news in 2030 may be different in that way or some other way, and other changes may intervene. But that's no reason not to have a plan. And so I think the UN has come up with a plan. It's a very generous plan in vision. It's overreaching. There's very little doubt about that in terms of the capacity of governments. But I think many citizens of developing countries will see reflected in the goals and targets many things that matter to them. And so should we in our societies, things reflected that are unfinished business in even the most advanced societies that we could perhaps work on too.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.